Welcome back to AP Television. In this episode, we're diving into one of the most important concepts in AP Macroeconomics, the limitations of GDP. Now, you might already know that GDP, or Gross Domestic Product, is used to measure a country's economic performance. But what if I told you that GDP doesn't always give us the full picture? It's kind of like judging how healthy someone is just by looking at their weight. It tells you something, but it doesn't tell you everything. So, by the end of this video, you'll know why GDP isn't perfect, what it misses, and how we can think beyond GDP when assessing an economy's health. Before we jump in, let's take a quick look at what we'll be covering today. Non-market activities, income inequality, environmental costs, underground economy, alternatives to GDP. Stick around, and I promise you'll understand GDP in a whole new way by the end. So let's get started with the basics. What does GDP actually miss? GDP measures the total market value of all final goods and services produced in a country during a specific time period. Sounds pretty comprehensive, right? Well, not exactly. One major limitation is that GDP doesn't account for non-market activities. Think about this: cooking dinner for your family, cleaning your house, or volunteering at your local food bank. These activities have real value, but they're not bought or sold in markets, so they don't get counted in GDP. But does that mean they're not important to the economy? Absolutely not. For example, if you hire a nanny to look after your children, that labor gets counted in GDP. But if you do it yourself, it doesn't. So, GDP underestimates the total economic activity that actually contributes to a society's well-being. Another big issue is that GDP doesn't measure income inequality. GDP tells us how much a country produces, but it doesn't tell us how that wealth is distributed. For instance, two countries could have the same GDP, but in one, most of the wealth could be concentrated in the hands of a few, while in the other, it's more evenly spread out. This is why economists often say that GDP doesn't measure who gets the pie. It only tells us how big the pie is. And this matters because a higher GDP doesn't necessarily mean better living conditions for everyone in a country. It's possible for GDP to grow, but for most people's incomes to remain stagnant or even decline. Think about it. A booming economy doesn't help much if only a small percentage of people are benefiting. For example, a nation might have a high GDP, but if most of the wealth is concentrated at the top, the standard of living for the majority of people may not reflect that growth. Now, let's talk about the environment. GDP doesn't account for the negative effects of economic activities, such as environmental degradation. This is a big one, especially today as we face global challenges like climate change and resource depletion. Here's an example. Say a company cuts down a forest to build a new factory. The economic activity of building the factory will boost GDP, but the long-term environmental damage, the loss of trees, the impact on wildlife, and the carbon emissions aren't subtracted from GDP. It's like running a business without accounting for your expenses. It's only telling you half the story. So while GDP goes up, the overall well-being of society might actually go down because we're losing something valuable, our natural resources. Next up, the underground economy. GDP doesn't account for economic activities that aren't officially reported. This includes the informal economy, like babysitting paid under the table, or even illegal activities like black market trading. In some countries, this sector can make up a significant part of total economic activity. In fact, for developing nations, the informal economy might be almost as large as the official economy. But because these activities aren't reported, they're not included in GDP, which means we're not getting the full picture. Let's take a moment to look at a real-life example that highlights GDP's limitations: the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in 2010. The spill caused extensive damage to marine ecosystems and the local economy, particularly industries like tourism and fishing. But here's the surprising part. Despite the environmental catastrophe, GDP actually increased. Billions of dollars were spent on cleanup efforts, legal battles, and rebuilding infrastructure. All that economic activity contributed to GDP, but it didn't reflect the long-term environmental damage or the negative impact on people's livelihoods. So while GDP showed growth, it didn't capture the destruction of natural resources, the loss of biodiversity, or the declining quality of life for local residents. This is why we need to look beyond GDP when assessing the overall health of an economy. Given all these limitations, economists have developed alternative measures to GDP. For instance, the Human Development Index, HDI, includes factors like life expectancy and education alongside income. The Genuine Progress Indicator, GPI, adjusts GDP for environmental degradation, income inequality, and non-market activities. And there's even Green GDP, which takes into account environmental sustainability. These indicators offer a more comprehensive view of a nation's well-being by looking at factors that GDP ignores. While GDP is useful, it's important to recognize its limitations and complement it with other measures. So, to wrap up, GDP is a valuable tool for measuring economic performance, but it has some major blind spots. It doesn't account for non-market activities, income inequality, environmental costs, or the underground economy. That's why it's crucial to think critically about GDP and consider what it's missing. Thanks for watching this lesson on the limitations of GDP. Don't forget to subscribe to AP Television for more AP Macroeconomics content, and we'll see you in the next video.